Muy buenas tardes. Bienvenidos un año más a la Conferencia Fliedner. Para la Cátedra Francisco José Ayala de Ciencia, Tecnología y Religión que yo dirijo, que pertenece a esta universidad, es un honor, una satisfacción acoger esta Conferencia Fliedner. Ya llevamos varios años celebrándola aquí. Esperamos que se siga celebrando bastantes más años, porque ya son 10 conferencias, con lo cual ya está bastante consolidada. Además, es una oportunidad para contar entre nosotros con personas de primer nivel en el diálogo entre ciencia y religión. Este año, además, estamos muy satisfechos por la conferenciante que vamos a poder escuchar en unos minutos, la profesora Sarah Coakley, porque nos encontramos ante una de las teólogas quizá más importantes del mundo, que está además haciendo un proyecto muy importante, una teología sistemática, que nos gustaría también ver publicada en español en algún momento, con lo cual es una satisfacción tremenda contar con ella, y creo que es una gran oportunidad que tenemos para poder escucharla, gracias pues al trabajo que realiza la Fundación Federico Fliedner y en concreto pues el Centro de Ciencia y Fe, a través del cual pues se organiza esta jornada. Le agradezco mucho que esté en esta universidad, al igual que a los miembros de la Fundación. También este año tenemos que agradecer la colaboración de la Asociación de Teólogas Españolas, la ATE, que también ha colaborado. De hecho, la profesora Coakley acaba de participar también en las jornadas que cada año, también desde varios años, desde hace ya un tiempo, pues viene celebrando la Asociación de Teólogas Españolas con mucho éxito, ¿no? Sin más, yo le voy a dar la palabra a los miembros de la mesa, a los que le agradezco también que me acompañen. En primer lugar, al decano de la Facultad de Teología del SEUT, don Israel Flores, y posteriormente pues, el doctor Pablo de Felipe se encargará de presentar a nuestra conferenciante. Muchas gracias de nuevo a todos por participar en esta 10ª Conferencia Fliedner, y Israel, tienes la palabra.
Muy bien. Pues es una alegría para nosotros estar en este día con todos vosotros. Agradecemos la aceptación de la invitación que os hemos hecho para participar en esta conferencia, la 10ª ya de las conferencias de Ciencia y Fe. Y con esto, como se acaba de mencionar, pues es realmente un gran privilegio tener a la doctora con nosotros. La Fundación Federico Fliedner también se complace en tenerla, y también agradecemos el que podamos realizar esta conferencia en este espacio de la Universidad de Comillas, que ya durante algunos años se lleva celebrando aquí. La Fundación Federico Fliedner, bueno, tiene sus colegios y también tiene la Facultad de Teología de SEUT, donde impartimos pues también las clases de teología y el grado en teología online, y tenemos también convenios con la Universidad de Comillas. Para nosotros es un motivo de alegría y todo un privilegio el que podamos tener esta tarde a la doctora con un tema pues tan importante también y tan suspicaz, y esperamos que nos llene sobre todo de muchas más preguntas su conferencia, y nos motive para seguir investigando en esta relación entre evolución, cooperación y la idea de Dios, y sus consecuencias para el nivel, para la sociología y bueno, para otros ámbitos, incluso de la teología y la filosofía. Pues sin más, le damos la palabra también a Pablo, pues porque queremos escuchar sobre todo a la doctora en esta noche. Gracias.
Bueno, pues buenas noches y muchas gracias por la asistencia a la que ya es la 10ª Conferencia Fliedner de Ciencia y Fe. Todavía me parece como muy cercano la primera edición que tuvimos, pero este año es la 10ª. Contamos con una ponente que hace gala de una combinación de conocimientos interdisciplinares muy interesante, empezando por la teología, con la filosofía y, como veremos, también con un conocimiento muy detallado de los debates actuales en la biología evolutiva. Nuevamente, como en otras ocasiones, hemos querido traer un tema a las conferencias Fliedner que esté fronterizo entre diferentes disciplinas y que nos ayude a derribar muros y fronteras. Para presentarla a ella, diré que Sarah Coakley estudió Teología en las universidades tanto de Cambridge como de Harvard, se doctoró en la primera y ha sido profesora en varias universidades a lo largo de los años. Recientemente, el año pasado, se jubiló de una cátedra de Teología en la Universidad de Cambridge y ahora, con un poco más de tiempo, sigue muy activa también en conferencias en todo el mundo. Ha publicado numerosos artículos y contribuciones también en diferentes libros sobre temas muy diversos. Dentro de la teología, temas como la patrística o teología sistemática actual, como hemos comentado antes. Pero lo que nos ha traído aquí, sin dejar del todo estos temas, que veremos que también se van a tocar, ha sido sobre todo su interés en un área de más filosofía de la ciencia y, en particular, la reflexión filosófica y teológica sobre lo que son los mecanismos de la evolución. Ella tiene una bien conocida colaboración con un biólogo matemático de la Universidad de Harvard, Martin Novak, a principios de esta década, que llevó a la publicación incluso de un libro específico sobre los temas de los que va a hablar en esta conferencia. El libro es Evolución, Juegos y Dios, el principio de cooperación, que se publicó en 2013, pero esto es solamente mi traducción del título, porque no está el libro disponible más que en inglés. Sería interesante también poder disponer de él. Sobre este tema, en el año 2012 impartió las conferencias Gifford en la Universidad de Aberdeen, en Escocia, y en el 2016 la prestigiosa conferencia Boyle en Londres. Y para nosotros es entonces un privilegio poder tener un pequeño resumen de toda esta labor en lo que es su primera visita a España y poder escuchar sus reflexiones en estos últimos años. Antes de introducir el tema que se va a hablar más específicamente, simplemente quería mencionar algunos detalles prácticos para la conferencia. Decir que será en inglés, que hay un servicio de traducción simultánea disponible, está a la entrada por si alguien no lo ha cogido todavía. También hay unas carpetas que espero que hayáis podido recoger en la entrada, si no podéis luego también cogerlas. Y en estas carpetas hay pues varias cosas que podéis ver. Hay por un lado un resumen de la conferencia, hay también una encuesta que nos gustaría, un pequeño cuestionario y también algunas informaciones sobre las instituciones que apadrinan esta actividad. También hay un formulario de amigos del Centro de Ciencia y Fe donde podéis dejar vuestros datos si queréis recibir información y también si queréis apoyar nuestra actividad, que es lo que agradeceríamos mucho. Todo esto está en esta carpetilla que podéis disponer de ella en la entrada y sí que os agradeceríamos si podríais dejar las encuestas y esto al salir en la mesa de la entrada. Para centrarnos ya en lo que va a ser el tema de esta noche, creo que es importante recordar una idea que es muy corriente a nivel popular, pero que siempre está ahí, y es cómo con bastante frecuencia se asocian las ideas de evolución y egoísmo genético. Ya en el siglo XIX se planteaba en algunos entornos la idea de la evolución como un conflicto, incluso como una guerra, con un lenguaje muy militar. Y se acuñó la expresión la supervivencia del más fuerte para describir a la evolución. De ahí se pasó no ya a explicar, sino incluso a legitimar toda una serie de conflictos y de comportamientos agresivos como si fueran una especie de fatalidad inevitable, algo que no se puede evitar, o incluso casi como una obligación que había que ayudar al conflicto. Esto claramente va más allá de la ciencia y entra en lo que sería un ámbito más ético, filosófico y teológico. Y no es de extrañar que ante esta situación, pues en ciertos sectores de la sociedad, religiosos, pero también otros no religiosos, pues se haya sentido ciertas reservas y cierto rechazo hacia las ideas de evolución que a veces pues se han trasladado también a un rechazo de lo que es la ciencia evolutiva. Y sin embargo, toda esta retórica y exaltación del conflicto no refleja exactamente lo que era el pensamiento de Darwin, que era más complejo, ni tampoco refleja lo que son las investigaciones más actuales en el ámbito de la evolución. Frente a la idea popular del gen egoísta, que es muy conocida, diversos investigadores llevan ya décadas trabajando en otros fenómenos evolutivos como la cooperación y el ámbito del altruismo. ¿Qué implicaciones tienen estos desarrollos científicos para nosotros? ¿Qué lectura se puede hacer de esta ciencia desde el ámbito de la filosofía, desde el ámbito de la ética y desde la teología cristiana? ¿Cómo enfocar esto? ¿Cómo podemos también reimaginar actualmente un concepto tan antiguo como la teología natural en el contexto de lo que es la ciencia actual? Entonces, estos son los temas que nuestra conferenciante se ha planteado hoy y que vamos a poder ver desarrollados en los próximos minutos. Así que muchas gracias por venir y le doy paso. Thank you.
It is a very great honor to be invited to lecture here in Madrid. And I want to start by thanking those who have so kindly invited me to Spain, and especially Pablo for his kind introduction to this lecture, and for his suggestion that I share with you some of my recent work on theology, philosophy, and evolutionary biology. Thus, in what follows tonight, I want to focus on one particular realm of contemporary science, evolutionary biology, in which a sustained attempt has indeed been made in recent decades to present secular science as if it came unproblematically front-loaded with particular ethical and cultural meanings. Yet many critical philosophers and theologians would strongly contest these presumptions. Now, I speak here of the contested arena of evolutionary cooperation, so-called, and how to explain it. That is, what it means scientifically, ethically, philosophically, and even theologically. And this will be the central focus of tonight's presentation. As we shall see, the reason this topic has become a lightning rod of theoretical contention in recent decades is that, on one rendition, the phenomenon of cooperation precisely supports the selfish gene ideology that has so dominated secular philosophy of biology of late, whereas on another rendition, it threatens that ideology at its core. Much is therefore at stake. Let me state in anticipation how my lecture will unfold tonight. I shall proceed in three major moves corresponding to the three sections of the paper. First, I shall provide as clear but as accessible an account as I am able of what evolutionary cooperation is, and why its explanation by a new generation of mathematical biologists, those who chart the regularities of evolutionary strategies, so-called, on a mathematical calculus of probability, have come into contestation over whether all such cooperation is explicable in terms simply of individual genetic advantage. The theoretical conundrum here has not only split mathematical and empirical biologists of late, but also divided factions within each of these communities. At base, then, there is a meaning-making impasse arising from a set of significant questions which, as I shall argue, demand philosophical interrogation, a probing back to what the British philosopher R.G. Collingwood once called the absolute presuppositions of the theoreticians involved. And this is tricky because often such absolute presuppositions are not completely out in the open and may even be unconsciously presumed, though with passion. Hence arise what I have called the current paroxysms in this arena of scientific debate. Secondly, I shall then move on to some of the major philosophical issues we have uncovered. These involve debates about ethics on the one hand, what cooperation bespeaks, as in these bees, as a potential hard wiring in evolution for human ethical behaviors and principles, and metaphysics, on the other hand, what cooperation may tell us about the fundamental patternings and processes of evolution, what constitutes their fundamental state of being and becoming. That's a metaphysical set of questions. Needless to say, these are no less contested arenas of debate than those at the first level of explanatory scientific theory. But once again, I shall dare to suggest to you that some of the richest recent developments in the understanding of cooperation actually march philosophically against what has in recent decades become a sort of orthodoxy in evolutionary theory. That is, that ethics as a subject is fundamentally reducible to genetic determinism and the propulsions of genetic selfishness, and that the metaphysics of evolution, on the other hand, is a matter of pure randomness, an arena vacated of any intrinsic meaning or purpose. That's become scientific orthodoxy. Thirdly, and if I have convinced you thus far, I shall end with a sketch of how I perceive natural theology, so-called, as a crucially important and continuing cultural project in the face of contemporary scientific debates such as this. In order to make this third case, I shall of course have to define, indeed redefine, natural theology rather carefully in order to stave off certain false expectations. Many of you may know that the term natural theology has accrued a bewildering range of possible meanings in the classic and modern periods of the West. And even the most famous book of this name in English, Natural Theology by William Paley, a book which entranced Darwin in his younger years, is often misunderstood as to its original intention and force. What I most certainly do not want to argue under this rubric of natural theology is that one could move from evidences about cooperation in evolution, as pervade within a secular scientific discourse often already propelled by atheistic presumptions, to an unproblematic public demonstration of God's existence. That would be a foolhardy ambition indeed. And actually, that particular hard-nosed construal of natural theology is itself a sort of modern chimera, as many before me have commented. But even in a brilliantly adjusted version of that modern ambition, which focuses on induction and probability rather than strict deductive force, and I'm thinking here of the magisterial work in analytic philosophy of religion by Richard Swinburne, my former colleague at Oxford, there are problems, even in his argument, about how to tot up the probabilities from the evidences at the end of the game, the end of the argument. And that takes us straight back into the realm of what existing beliefs and absolute presuppositions are being brought to the table by the contestants in the first place. And I'm going to come back to that issue briefly at the end of this lecture. However, I do not want to fall back either on the much weaker theological alternative to such inductive argument, which is often assumed to be the only credible default contemporary position left for natural theology now. That is, a preferential and thus entirely optional Christian interpretation of evolution from an already presumed basis in systematic theology and revelation. My proposed alternative, as we shall see, attempts to escape between the horns of these dilemmas by attempting a subtler and third alternative, which focuses on what crucial shifts may happen in the knowing subject, precisely in ruminating on the idea of evolution as a whole, and especially through the lens of debate about the mysterious phenomenon of cooperation. This involves not just a survey of the scientific evidences for cooperation, and then a deeper and necessary probing of the possible philosophical implications of its meaning, for it finally calls forth, I shall argue, a special kind of perusal of the whole, one in which spiritual as well as ethical decisions and commitments are entertained and educed. It is in this sense that I shall argue we may say, and most fruitfully speak, of natural theology today. It has a particular role in this contemplative cultivation of what I, following some of the early Christian fathers, call spiritual sensation. Now, in order to effect these three major moves within the space of a short lecture, I'm going to have to move not only deftly, but with a certain daring boldness, for which I ask forgiveness in advance. But your handout and the PowerPoint and the translation should assist you as we move through the argument. So, first, why evolutionary cooperation matters. We must be extremely careful first to be clear what we mean by cooperation in the evolutionary context. Indeed, the scientific and philosophical literature itself, even now, is littered with confusion about its precise definition and its relation to altruism, with which it is often identified. And this semantic confusion greatly exacerbates the already contentious theoretic debates about its explanation and significance. There is also more general confusion caused when cooperation is used too loosely and colloquially to mean merely collaboration between different individuals with mutual benefit. For in evolutionary population, this is called mutualism, and it clearly furthers the fitness of both parties. And thus its evolutionary perdurance is not difficult to explain. Whereas the same is not obviously true of cooperation. So what precisely is cooperation then, and why is it so puzzling to the evolutionary theoreticians? A decent, acceptable rendition, which is made the more precise when provided with a mathematical formulation, runs thus, and I have given you this definition on your handout. Cooperation is the phenomenon encountered right across the evolutionary spectrum, from microorganisms right through to humans, in which one entity within an evolutionary population suffers a loss of fitness and another correlatively, connectedly gains fitness. In other words, this phenomenon represents a calculus of gain for the evolutionary cooperation through loss. And we might, in more theologically laden terms, call this productive sacrifice. Notice, however, and by way of immediate caution, that there is nothing in this initial definition of cooperation that says anything about intentionality. Cooperation is simply an evolutionary phenomenon amongst ants and bees and bacteria, etc., that happens in various forms. And this is what is so interesting and puzzling, since the selfish gene worldview would suggest that such manifestations of unselfishness would naturally be screened out in the process of evolutionary selection. The fact that cooperation is not screened out, but in fact stabilizes naturally in various circumstances in a continuous dance with its opposite, defection, that is, direct individual selfishness, which seems so much more expectable, is what requires theoretic explanation. But let us not abandon the issue of intentionality either, since in humans and some of the higher mammals, this becomes an especially interesting empirical addition to the more generic phenomenon of cooperation as just defined. That is why I prefer to distinguish cooperation in general from altruism as a subset of it, in which there is intentional surrendering of fitness by one individual or set of individuals in an evolutionary population for the sake of or out of love or regard for another or others. Here's the Good Samaritan, an example of this. To engage in altruism so defined will therefore require a level of consciousness, of will, and at least rudimentary beliefs to qualify. And thus the question of what species other than the human are also capable of altruism, so defined, as opposed to unmotivated cooperation more generally, is another issue currently under debate. Why then has giving an account of cooperation in evolution become so paroxysmic of late for empirical and mathematical biologists? Why? The answer lies in the debate about what causes it and how to explain it. And indeed, much hangs here on the technical parsing of these two key philosophical notions. But it is the mathematical modeling of evolutionary processes which has proved so fruitful in the last decades in giving a precise account of the surprising prevalence and significance of cooperation alongside defection or selfishness in evolutionary populations. Darwin's theories are now subject to a mathematical calculus. The big question here is how the basic movements of mutation and selection in evolution are conjoined with cooperation and defection to structure evolutionary processes. To put it simply and briefly, drawing on an important survey article by the Harvard mathematical biologist Martin Novak, with whom I have myself collaborated for some 15 years now, there are at least 4 or 5 explanatory circumstances which have now been identified and clarified by mathematical biologists as yielding sustained forms of cooperation when we would not prima facie expect it. These are the rules which help explain why it is that cooperation isn't just screened out. The first rule for explaining cooperation, as Novak puts it, is the basic one, but also the one where most of the current drama and disagreement is being played out within evolutionary biology, since much depends here on how it is accounted for mathematically. The last, the fifth, is an explanatory model for cooperation which many evolutionary biologists of this generation still suspect is bogus, because it moves beyond an individual fitness calculus to a group one. To anticipate, one's view on the mathematical frame of the first explanation will tend to be rather closely connected to whether one sees force in the fifth one at all. So let me now quickly run through these 5 rules for the stable appearance of cooperation, as outlined by Novak. The first rule, commonly known as kin selection or inclusive fitness, explains cooperation in terms of the benefits accrued not to the cooperator itself, who takes the fitness loss, of course, but to its genetic relatives, thus ensuring that individual genetic advantage, otherwise known as selfishness, still does, in a sense, endure, though not through the cooperator, but through its genetic relatives. Now, following the original insights on this phenomenon by the British philosopher and indeed communist J.B. Haldane, who said, "I will jump into a river to save cousins and more distant cousins," it was William Hamilton who later attempted to formalize this first cooperative mechanism mathematically, whereby, as you see here, the coefficient of relatedness must exceed the cost of cooperation over the benefit of cooperation. And this formula, this very simple formula, came to be called Hamilton's rule, which sought to explain mathematically why kin selection works. But not so long ago, Novak and the aging E.O. Wilson at Harvard and a younger mathematician colleague, Karina Tanita, challenged contentiously the mathematical efficacy and explanatory force of Hamilton's rule. And this is what has caused the explosion, the paroxysm in evolutionary biology on this front. E.O. Wilson, whom you may know as the great octogenarian expert on cooperation in the ants, thereby effected a dramatic theological volte-face in rejecting Hamilton's rule alongside Novak and Tanita, because he had been, for many decades, one of the prime defenders of inclusive fitness theory. It's always exciting when a very great scientist completely changes his mind. Something is going on that's important. Now note that Novak and his immediate colleagues do not now challenge thereby the importance of kin as such, as a key factor in the evolving of cooperation. As any empirical biologist will testify of work in the field, the vast majority of cases of unselfish cooperation is witnessed in genetic relations, whether close or remote. That's not the contentious issue as such. The problem is that in our generation, whole academic careers have been built on the particular mathematical force of Hamilton's rule, along with a set of more hidden philosophical presumptions that have tended to be smuggled in with it. And I'm going to comment on these shortly. To put it a little contentiously, we might say that for many such biologists, Hamilton's rule has become the key unifying story of their research, the key unifying story of evolution, a fulcrum of meaning which has in effect replaced the holistic interpretation of nature supplied in much earlier generations by classic natural theology. Now, the second, third, and fourth rules for cooperation are in a way intriguing variants on the first, but do not intrinsically require genetic relatedness in the same way as the first. The second rule, known as direct reciprocity, originally investigated by Robert Trivers, urges that if one individual in an evolutionary population cooperates, another individual might in due course be drawn to cooperate too, by imitation, and such might extend a chain of imitative cooperation to some mutual benefit, at least for a while, until selfish defection breaks in once more. Even then, a so-called forgiving strategy may sometimes help to re-establish chains of cooperation. The third rule, known as indirect reciprocity, originally explored with particular insight by the young Novak and his Austrian teacher Carl Sigmund, applies principally in the human realm, although conceivably a rudimentary form of it can also be efficacious in higher mammals in the absence of specifically human language. Here, one individual cooperates with another, whom he or she may never meet again, but the behavior of cooperation is observed by others in the population and eventually evolutionarily rewarded because of that. Natural selection thus turns out to favor strategies that base the option to cooperation on the so-called reputation of the recipient. Now, once human language is in play, this mechanism becomes particularly effective because reputations spread by human gossip and innuendo. As the Harvard biologist David Haig has put it, for direct reciprocity, you need a face, but for indirect reciprocity, you need a name. A fourth circumstance in which cooperation can win out in evolutionary populations occurs in what is now called spatial selection, sometimes called network reciprocity, in which defection does not naturally dominate, as in well-mixed populations, because individual cooperators here form clusters which protect and enhance the success of their cooperation. It turns out that one can graph such clusterings of cooperation, and that a surprisingly simple rule determines whether network reciprocity will favor cooperation. The benefit to cost ratio in fitness terms must exceed the average number of neighbors per individual in the cluster. But it is with Novak's so-called fifth rule, however, group selection, that real argument sets in again with force. For here it is hypothesized that the focus on the individual cooperator or defector must give way to a group analysis. For even in the fourth rule, the so-called clusterings involved still fundamentally relate to a competition between individuals. In group selection, however, the group is the explanatory unit, not the individual. Now, this is the phenomenon on which Darwin himself had such a notable and prescient intuition in his late work, The Descent of Man. Sometimes Darwin goes right ahead of himself in scientific reflection in a way that only nearly 100 years later mathematical explanation can be brought in to illuminate. And as Darwin put it in that book, explicitly using the language of sacrifice, I quote here, "There can be no doubt that a tribe including many members who are always ready to give aid to each other and to sacrifice themselves for the common good would be victorious over other tribes. And this would be natural selection." On this vision of cooperation, a population is divided from the start into groups. And in some cases, groups of cooperators manifestly fare better than groups naturally tending towards defection. Now, the reasons for this continue to be debated, and much depends on how one models group selection mathematically. It's here that the defenders of Hamilton's rule display their greatest skepticism, given their unshakable commitment to an individualistic and solely kin-related account of all cooperative phenomena. However, as Novak and his colleagues stringently argue, in a competition between cooperator groups and defector groups, pure cooperator groups can indeed be demonstrated mathematically to grow faster than pure defector groups. Darwin was onto something here then, it seems, even though most theoreticians who remain committed to Hamilton's rule vigorously deny that he was right. Now what conjoins all five of these different evolutionary mechanisms outlined by Novak, which explain how evolutionary cooperation can endure, is what Novak calls a payoff matrix, in which cooperation can be shown to be favored in repeated choices between the two basic strategies of cooperation and defection. And what is particularly fascinating about this discovery is that it explains the seemingly paradoxical fact that whereas defectors always win out initially in a well-mixed population, they do so at the cost of declining average fitness in the population as a whole, if and when too many defect. This is the take-home lesson. Defection, selfishness, in this sense, undoes itself in excess, whereas cooperation in its various forms is the mysterious key to the regeneration of fitness in a population. This is the thing I'd really want you to remember. Mathematically, it's now been shown if you have too many defectors in an evolutionary population, this will ultimately undo the fitness of the population. Further, there is intriguing, though unfinished evidence from the later work of Maynard Smith and Zatmary especially, that the great transition moments in the history of evolution, from individually replicating molecules to chromosomes, from prokaryotes to eukaryotes, or from asexual reproduction to sexual reproduction, for instance, in the great tree of evolution, these moments of transition were seemingly rendered possible only as a result of a phase of preparatory, stable cooperation. Cooperation was thus the matrix of these crucial transitional developments. Across the whole history of evolution, it seems, the countervailing propulsion of cooperation over against defection has played a creative and central role. As a result of the mathematical clarification of these pervasive cooperative mechanisms, then, and of their necessity for populations' regeneration and flourishing, Novak has gone so far as to describe cooperation as a third principle of evolution, alongside mutation and selection. This claim, too, of course, remains controversial. Yet, according to him and his colleagues, together these three principles can account for the recurring structures of evolutionary processes, and thus for certain consistent stochastic regularities within them. For Novak, in other words, the mathematicalization of cooperation has revealed what he calls dynamic or repetitive patternings in evolution, patternings which fan out to include creative and explicable group phenomena. For Novak's detractors, however, staunch defenders, all of them, of Hamilton's rule, cooperation is simply another index of individual genetic determinism amidst the random flux of evolutionary mutation and selection. For such a position, too, even motivated human altruism is reducible to a mere manifestation of genetic determinism. As E.O. Wilson wrote in his earlier days, along with the philosopher of science Michael Ruse, I quote, listen to this quotation, "Ethics is a collective illusion of the genes, put in place to make us good cooperators. Nothing more, but also nothing less." That's a big reductive claim, but it has motivated secular evolutionary biology now for several decades. It was that earlier position of Wilson's that played so decisively into Richard Dawkins' hands. The distinctive selfish gene ideology was up and running. But which account of cooperation do we now favour, and on what grounds? This first part of my lecture has necessarily been the longest, and I've done it the slowest, since we cannot begin to understand the current controversy over cooperation unless we comprehend something of the technical and mathematical contours of the theoretic debate. And even now, this theoretic debate, I think, is not generally culturally known. But now it's time to take philosophical stock and to move to my second level of analysis, that of the often buried absolute presuppositions in this debate, which I mentioned at the outset. For it may by now already be clear that neither the contested mathematics of cooperation as such, nor even the many empirical biological evidences which accompany it, can by themselves resolve the meaning-making impasse which we have uncovered in the theorizing of cooperation. Fundamental ethical and metaphysical issues are at stake and have to be faced and probed. We can't avoid philosophical issues here. And it is by no means obvious to me that the pervasive and reductive story of the selfish gene is what scientists call the best explanation philosophically, when the rich and wide variety of cooperative phenomena are considered with a more open mind. We may recall for a moment how Richard Dawkins felt obliged to add an extra chapter on cooperation to the second edition of his famous book, The Selfish Gene, since the phenomenon might have seemed to raise a threat to his central argument about pervasive genetic selfishness. On the contrary, argued Dawkins, using rather emotively the ghoulish example of sacrificial blood-sucking bats, nice guys, as he put it, do indeed finish first, because, of course, their niceness, the niceness of blood-sucking bats, is really only the propulsion to genetic advantage all along. It's a very clever chapter, and as usual, written with brilliant incisiveness by Dawkins, but you don't realize you're being persuaded to a completely reductive conclusion. Yet a mark of the strange aporia to which the debate has subsequently led is the form which the initial rebuttal of Novak, Wilson, and Tarnita's critique of inclusive fitness took in an enraged letter to the journal Nature. In it, strikingly, there was no attempt by the 137 signatories to respond to the actual mathematical critique supplied in the original article, and it's doubtful that many, if any of them, even understood it. It was enough that the hegemony of Hamilton's account of inclusive fitness had been challenged at all. Here was an absolute presupposition the complainants shared about their core explanation of cooperation, and it brought to the surface a host of other entirely contestable ethical and metaphysical commitments. These are well evidenced in an instructive blog by Steven Pinker and his friends. It's called The False Allure of Group Selection, in which Pinker reiterates his commitment to a reductive genetic rendition of natural selection, so attractive, he insists, because it is so mechanistic. He likes that. deploring group selection theorizing as mere fuzzy, he doesn't believe in it, he reiterates his accustomed reduction of human ethical sensibility to selfish genetic coding, albeit sometimes disguised as altruism under the reputational pressures of indirect reciprocity. Yet the problem here, as one of Pinker's interlocutors, Herb Gintis, immediately riposts on the same blog, is that Pinker simply refuses to take seriously the mounting empirical evidence for a widespread, indeed perhaps universal, basic moral sensibility in humans, one which can in no obvious way be reduced to purely genetic propulsion. The lesson from this revealing interchange seems to be this: if the strategy of reducing all ethics to genetics is under question, because the purported mathematical demonstration of inclusive fitness is also in trouble, then it cannot be that a desperate reassertion of Hamilton's rule on the grounds of a preference for mechanistic simplicity is a convincing ploy of rebuttal. Instead, it merely smacks of vicious circularity. In contrast, I urge that the stage is now open for a rich philosophical debate about the various ethical theories that might best and most convincingly cohere with the evidences of evolutionary cooperation and its human motivational variant, altruism, and about what accompanying meta-ethical principles will appropriately protect such an endeavor. For it is by no means obvious that a narrow utilitarian calculus that we find in Pinker, for instance, wins the day here, especially once the hegemony of Hamilton's rule is challenged. Indeed, as I argue in much greater length in my Gifford lectures of 2012, either a developmental virtue ethics founded in natural law and or an evolutionarily reworked Kantian theory of the categorical imperative appear much better contenders to help explain evolutionary cooperation as we now understand it. Again, we need to focus on the argument to what would constitute the best explanation. The great advantage of an evolutionary approach to ethics, of course, is that it has the capacity to explain how certain profound ethical sensibilities are hardwired into the human psyche and body, seemingly from a more ancient evolutionary source. But it would be a grave mistake to conclude from this that all forms of human altruism are explanatorily reducible merely to states of enlightened evolutionary selfishness and short-term utilitarian goals. Indeed, what we might call excessive forms of productive altruistic sacrifice are regularly manifested in human culture, and indeed taught as higher forms of righteousness, both by the prophets, Jesus included, and by philosophers. How we then theorize these, whether as meaningless cultural spandrels or as manifestations of a more demanding and universal form of human altruism yet to be fully realized in response to previously unparalleled global threats of war, terrorism, and ecological disaster, is one of the most pressing ethical issues of our time. Rarely has altruism been so important for our survival. The point, however, is that this debate must be joined philosophically and cannot be foreclosed by dogmatic and questionable presumptions within the scientific field of evolutionary biology itself. A second and equally important philosophical debate spawned by the evolutionary evidences of cooperation concerns the very way we choose to think about the metaphysics of evolution, not just about the ethics of evolution. That is, about its fundamental being or becoming, its basic structures and patternings. We've already noted the penchant in reductive genetic accounts of cooperation to a concomitant foreclosure on these metaphysical questions. Evolution on this view is, ex hypothesi, wholly random and unpurposive. The evolutionary tape, as Stephen Jay Gould once famously remarked, can never be rewound or repeated in any form, and it comes with no implicit value or meaning either. But again, the material we have surveyed in the first section of this paper already surely gives the lie to such a dogmatic metaphysical presumption. Indeed, the intimations of certain forms of structure and purposiveness in the story we have told seem increasingly hard to deny. Consider again the discovery that cooperation manifests itself through the whole spectrum of evolutionary life, and with remarkably consistent formations and patternings which can now be mathematically modeled. Consider again the suggestive discovery by Maynard Smith and Satmari that at key moments in the evolution of more complex forms of life, stable cooperation formed a vital and productive matrix of transition in this larger perspective on evolution's tree of life. A picture of creative, repetitious patterning thus emerges at a second and different level of evolutionary significance, right across the story of evolution. Consider, too, the remarkable behaviors in manifestations of cooperation found amongst some of the higher mammals, meerkats especially, and dolphins and whales, to cite particularly significant and evocative examples, which evidence powerful, excessive cooperative ingenuity and flexibility in the face of multiple threats to flourishing, and already prefigure something of the intentional and empathetic dimensions of developed human altruism. Consider finally the growth and extension of purposive altruism amongst human themselves in the history of human life, which on occasions may take intensified or extended or even ecstatic form to respond to particular cultural and international crises, moving well beyond what immediate genetic or even national groups sustains it. We do well, of course, always to remind ourselves that manifestations of evolutionary cooperation and altruism are not good per se. Pinker likes to point out that human cooperation also figured large in Nazi programs, just as it does today in, say, suicide bombings. But this is precisely why these human phenomena beg, as we have already argued, careful, critical, ethical theoretization and moral adjudication. There is no naive ethical meliorism implied in my analysis, as Darwin the Victorian sometimes succumbed to. Darwin was inclined to think that human evolution would result in higher and higher forms of altruism. We know that isn't always the case. What I'm urging, however, against all theoretic fashion in evolutionary biology, which still roundly eschews all talk of teleology or purposiveness, is the attribution of certain forms of patterned and pervasive cooperative structure to different levels of the evolutionary spectrum, including the purposive forms which arise in intentionally motivated higher mammal cooperation and human altruism. To suggest such, of course, is to make a metaphysical proposal about evolution's fundamental or ontology, or of evolution dynamics, as Novak likes to call it. But once we get this far, we are already implicitly raising probing questions about evolution as a whole. And this, of course, brings me to my third and last section, which is much briefer. Here I'm going to be, at least I hope, philosophically and theologically suggestive, even if I don't convince you. So we come at last to the question of God, recasting natural theology according to what I call spiritual sense. Now, there is a tradition of spiritual contemplation from the ancient world, which I wish to retrieve in this last section on natural theology. According to this tradition, which had its roots in Platonic and Neoplatonic forms of philosophizing, and from there passed into certain important influential strands of early Christianity, a form of spiritual practice is assumed as a necessary complement to scientific, philosophical, or theological reasoning at its broadest. In the exposition of the great 3rd century Alexandrian theologian Origen, for instance, this practice takes a classic threefold form of spiritual assent. There is first the preparatory phase called ethicae, in which the contemplative's moral sensibility is preliminarily sharpened and purified by reflection on ethical questions. But then comes the stage in the spiritual life for Origen, which particularly concerns me in tonight's context, and this he calls physicae, the patient learning of a contemplative posture which seeks to attend to the world as a whole and its distinctive patternings, and thus to intuit God's purpose in it and for it. Finally, there is contemplation proper, what he calls enopticae, by which the contemplative is united even more directly with God in God's self, in union. Now, why this seemingly arcane and completely outmoded Origenistic tradition is of importance for my attempted retrieval of a certain form of natural theology in the context of an assessment of the evidences of evolutionary cooperation, I shall now explain. The reason first is that Origen saw in his three-stage contemplative progression not only an ethical purification for the knowing subject, but also a sensory and intellectual transformation. To learn to see, and in particular to see the world as a whole, as suffused with the divine, was, he called it, an act of spiritual sensation, which could not be hurried in its development, but would in due course involve a subtle but profound change in the knowing subject itself, a new integration of the moral, the intellectual, and the affective. Moreover, this new seeing was for Origen no mere optional preference or mere perspective. It was a growth in actual insight, a new depth of penetration into reality itself. Such was the alignment of contemplative practice and intellectual scientific questing in the philosophical tradition that Origen wove into his newfound Christianity. It is such a practice of contemplative intuition of physicae, seeing the world, or in this case evolution as a whole, which commends itself to me afresh as a form of natural theology, which avoids some of the traps of the available contemporary alternatives mentioned at the outset of this lecture. This contemplative unification does not, as such, note, pretend to be an argument for God's existence, ab initio, as such, but instead creatively probes the richness of the human epistemological response, noetic, affective, moral, required for any such argument to have final personal force. Even a probabilistic set of cumulative arguments for God, such as Richard Swinburne famously presents in his classic work on the existence of God, still requires, as he himself admits, some such extra final epistemic or spiritual account of what finally sways the surveyor of the arguments personally. I look at all the arguments for God's existence, I tot up their probabilities, but what makes me say, yes, here I see God? For this, I propose, one needs the transformed contemplative gaze. Moreover, this alternative vision of natural theology is a particularly creative alternative, I submit, to a problem that the great Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant struggled with all his life, and finally bequeathed to us in strangely unresolved form. And indeed, Kant's shadow hangs over modern philosophy of science in a very important way. For Kant, order or teleology in nature always in one sense seemed to be strangely obvious, even after his so-called critical turn in philosophy. Hence, those of you who know Kant will know that he calls the physico-theological argument for God's existence, i.e. the argument for design, still very attractive. It seems to have a natural allure for him, even in the first critique and later works. And yet, after his turn to critical philosophy, he could never finally attribute teleology, let alone divine teleology, directly to nature itself, since such ordering and purposiveness was now reserved for the realm of the human epistemic subject, imposing it onto nature. A characteristically modern split therefore opened up between the world considered scientifically and objectively, for the purposes of knowledge as to pure reason, according to Kant, and the world considered as a whole and as if ordained to God, which he puts in the realm of practical reason. And hence, natural theology, in any available modern sense, eluded the critical Kant's grasp. Kant was, of course, absolutely right to stress that the act of perceiving the world as a unity is crucially different epistemically from the scientific investigation of any one part of it. But it is this gap between the world in itself and the human knowing and willing subject which the more ancient contemplative tradition of spiritual sense seeks to bridge. The possibility of such an epistemic alternative would, of course, have been denied by Kant himself, according to the dictates of his own particular critical thought. And yet the longing for it, the longing to conjoin the knowing subject with the world as a whole as it is, still hangs around his thinking, particularly right at the end of the first critique and right at the end of the third critique. Likewise, as I have unfolded in the logic of tonight's lecture, the ethical and metaphysical decisions called forth out of reflective scientific consideration of the working of evolutionary cooperation are ones that cannot be avoided philosophically, granted the complexity and suggestiveness of the scientific evidences. But the final tug to see evolution's meaning as a whole goes into this different and less familiar realm, no longer strictly evolutionary science as such, nor yet even philosophy of science, although it's evoked and inspired by them both. This is instead a realm, I put it to you, of spiritual intuition or spiritual sensation, a realm in which one perhaps first wonders that there is anything at all, and then learns to wonder at the remarkable possibility that what there is discloses divine meaning as a unity. Such, at any rate, represents a contemplative natural theology or physicae, which I dare to commend to you afresh. Whilst it does not claim to deliver either a deductive or inductive argument for God's existence as such, what it does deliver is something more subtle and spiritually interesting, a changed epistemic perception of the evolutionary whole as suffused with divine meaning and unity of purpose. As such, it represents, I suggest, a serious intellectual rival to the unitary meaning deemed by so many secular scientists to be supplied by Hamilton's rule. Indeed, on reflection, we might playfully call that alternative a natural a-theology, one in which all meaning is staked on reductive genetic physicalism. Note that these secular atheistical scientists don't worry at all about telling you a story about the whole of evolution. And they tell you a completely reductive story in which ethics is reduced to genetic determinism. Are you going to buy that? Or is there some other story that you would like to consider? My conclusions. It has been the burden of this lecture to insist that natural theology is an undertaking that may continue to have a profound intuitive and spiritual appeal, despite the successive assaults of modern empirical philosophy and science. The current debate about the ultimate meaning of evolutionary cooperation has been taken as a revealing indication and example of this phenomenon, whilst reductive genetic accounts of cooperation dogmatically expostulate against the idea of any ethical or any teleological meaning encoded in it, ironically thereby subscribing to a unitive anti-meaning posture with a powerfully cynical meaning. I have argued otherwise. The first lesson we have rehearsed here is that science and theology must never eschew the crucial mediating role of critical philosophy, especially in the realms of ethical and metaphysics, in any negotiation between the two disciplines. But even more important is the issue of the particular epistemological status of a natural theological argument. I have argued here that a natural theological approach is not of the same genre as an argument simply for God's existence on the basis of empirical evidence. But nor is it a mere optional theology of nature, a matter of imposing preordained personal theological preferences front-loaded with assumed dogmatic content. Rather, through patient reflection on the remarkable patternings revealed in cooperative phenomena throughout the evolutionary spectrum, there arises the possibility of a distinctive epistemic and spiritual and moral response called forth by them. This goes beyond the mere recording of mathematical regularity towards a wrestling with the ethical and theological questions encoded in cooperation, and climaxes in the fundamental idea of what might unify and resolve these questions. It is the spiritual and philosophic force of such questioning which ultimately concerns me here. What does it take to see the world as unified, to see it as God's, if not via a personal transformation which involves desire and affect and moral change as much as dispassionate cognition? This is, to be sure, no clinching evidential argument for God's existence, nor is it part of evolutionary science per se. Yet, as I trust I have maybe persuaded you, it is no mere fideism or naive doctrinal experientialism either. Instead, it's a unified spiritual thought experiment based in critical reflection on evolutionary cooperation and its possible ethical and metaphysical meanings, and sustained by a demanding and repeated act of contemplation. In transforming and reordering one to the very possibility of God's suffusive presence in the world, such contemplation may itself evince a new creative posture of hope and of extended altruistic endeavor for the world and its contemporary struggles. I thank you for your patience and intense attention.
Hola, buenas tardes. Felicitarle por la conferencia y lo interesante que ha sido. Me ha suscitado una pregunta que me he hecho hace tiempo y con respecto a lo que usted comentaba, si el altruismo se da entre individuos de las mismas especies siempre o se puede dar entre individuos de distintas especies.
Excellent question. Excellent. This is one of the most important arenas in which the mathematicalization of cooperation is only beginning to extend. So up to now, the mathematicalization of cooperation has largely been devoted to looking at the internal dynamics within species. But of course, when we look at the evolution as a whole, it's the interaction between species that is the other crucial dimension of how the whole evolutionary spectrum is opening up. And often new forms of cooperation within species only arise because that species is being threatened by another species, or is being threatened by changes in ecology, by changes in climate, as we're experiencing now. So, for instance, in southern Africa at the moment, the extraordinary drought is causing meerkats to behave in new ways of even more intensified cooperation, whilst they struggle with lack of resources as well as assaults from larger animals. So to give a complete picture of everything that we want to explain, we would have to complexify the mathematicalization. And Novak and his friends are now trying to extend that attempt into the constant dance in cooperation and defection between species as well as within species. This is a vitally unfinished area. And so your question is even cleverer than you think, because this may cause us to reconsider the dynamics when we understand this better.
Una pregunta más.
I think people are getting up their courage.
Hola, muchas gracias por la fantástica conferencia. Mi pregunta tiene que ver con esa necesidad de entender el mundo como una unidad de la que habla Kant. Si esa necesidad no sería más bien, claro, ¿es humana o está en la naturaleza? ¿Es una ambición nuestra o, claro, porque esa es el tercer punto, creo que pivota sobre esa cuestión y claro, la cuestión de la falacia naturalista.
Yeah. What an excellent question again. We can only speculate about this, can't we? And when we speculate about it, we can always be accused of imposing our anthropocentrism on the higher mammals. But even Richard Dawkins draws attention to the phenomenon of delight and exaltation, which is sometimes manifested in higher mammal behaviors or in bird behaviors. And we cannot theorize what these animals and birds are, quote, thinking. But if we believe that our human endowment evolutionary comes through hard wiring, through our evolutionary history, we should always be open to the possibility that our intuitions have some evolutionary basis. So delight in beauty, joy, ecstatic joy, unexplained forms of excessive altruism, as we see, for instance, in dolphins protecting sometimes other species when they have been harmed. These are all part of the perspective that makes us think there's more here than the reductionists have given form to. As for the desire to unify, as I stressed at the end of the lecture, note that the reductive scientists are completely besotted with unitary explanation. They want to explain the whole of evolutionary processes away as genetic determinism. And so they can't say we don't need explanations as a whole, because they themselves make these explanations as a whole. The question is, are they the right explanations as a whole? Thank you.
Nuevamente, muchísimas gracias por la excelente conferencia. Yo quería plantear una cuestión que va más allá de la biología, en la línea de lo que podríamos llamar también cooperación según la definición que nos ha dado, que es, digamos, el sacrificio en beneficio de otra cosa, que puede darse también fuera de lo biológico. Podríamos pensarlo así. Y concreto, en las últimas décadas hemos aprendido mucho acerca de la vida de las estrellas, cómo nacen, evolucionan y mueren. Y sabemos, por ejemplo, que nuestro sistema solar, con la composición química que tiene, no ha podido existir sino después de una tercera generación de estrellas. Ha tenido que haber un proceso de destrucción de las primeras generaciones de estrellas para que pudieran generarse elementos químicos de pesos atómicos mayores que nos permitiesen llegar no solo al carbono, sino a muchos otros elementos químicos que son los que han posibilitado la vida. Entonces, me parece que podría incluso llegar a plantearse una especie de cooperación en este sentido, desde el punto de vista incluso no biológico, sino como si existiera en el universo un principio mucho más profundo que responda realmente a ese planteamiento.
That's really fascinating. Are you, sir, yourself a physicist or a cosmologist?
I'm really very fond of astrophysics and science and so on.
Right. Now, the straightforward answer to your question is that I don't know, but I think that is a very fascinating question to open up. It's normally opened up under the category of fine-tuning, if you know that term. Is that a term you use? So in other words, how do we explain how the cosmos gave rise to the possibility for life? And I see my work in cooperation as a kind of biological parallel to the fine-tuning argument for God's existence, which is already a well-established, the so-called anthropic principle. I've never thought of reading cooperation as such into the astrophysical realm. I think it would take a slightly different definition, a different form. But when reconstrued as fine-tuning, I think it's distinctly parallel. And in my Gifford lectures, I do actually, unlike tonight, construct an argument for God's existence from cooperation. And then I put it alongside other arguments that have been presented for God's existence, including one from the cosmological realm, which I think then put together strengthen the force of the argument. But it still needs this crucial spiritual capacity to respond to the idea of the whole. And that's what I've been trying to focus on as not necessarily a theological task, but certainly a contemplative task, which has its own special epistemological status. Okay. But thank you, wonderful question.
Sí, doctora Coakley.
Yes, Coakley. Yeah. It's difficult to pronounce in Spanish.
En primer lugar, enhorabuena por su dedicación tan amplia como usted ha demostrado y la gran profundidad en su exposición y en su conocimiento de lo que es la evolución a través de los tiempos. No puedo entrar, digamos, a su nivel, evidentemente, ni el grado de matematización que hace tantos biólogos matemáticos o biólogos o matemáticos sobre el tema. Sin embargo, hay una cosa que me gustaría, en conexión con lo que usted ha dicho de espiritualidad y de Dios, que es el tema, que a mí más me atraía para venir aquí, que es esa conexión. Entonces, vista la exposición de lo que es la evolución en su genética, en su cooperación, en su altruismo y hablando también del gen egoísta, ¿no cree usted que la evolución humana es la peor de todas las evoluciones que hay en el género, es decir, en la naturaleza, desde el punto de vista de que realmente si los humanos fuéramos mucho más conscientes o nos adaptáramos o aceptáramos mucho más nuestra condición, no seríamos mucho más capaces de haber desarrollado una evolución mucho mayor de la que tenemos. Quizá es muy simple, pero creo que es algo que es bueno desarrollar.
You are absolutely right, sir, that when we get to the human realm, we have this enormous ethical divergence, all right? We are hardwired both to defect and to cooperate. But we have, as humans, the capacity to defect more destructively than any other creature. And we also have the capacity to cooperate more constructively than any other creature. And once we begin to understand this responsibility, and once we begin to understand that the crises that face us in our world today require of us a level of altruism that the human nature has, I think, very rarely achieved up to now. If we're going to even go on existing, we are going to have to cooperate internationally on ecological questions in a way that we've never done. And we have to do it despite the fact that we are constrained by our democratic governments, which only make decisions for 4 years at a time. But we have the internet, so it can be done now. So there's both huge hope here and also huge despair when you look at the destructiveness that we are capable of having, compared with which the behaviors of dolphins and meerkats look saintly, frankly. So our sensibility towards animals is going along, or should be going along, with our understanding of our responsibility as humans for animals and for ecological life. And I think understanding these dynamics is a crucial part of this, because even if you're not religious, if you start to think about these dynamics, you see what we're up against. Thank you.
Otra pregunta.
People want their dinner.
Bueno, pues lo dejamos aquí porque la profesora Coakley además tiene que participar aún en las jornadas de la E.T.S este fin de semana. Y yo le agradezco de nuevo que haya estado hoy con nosotros, porque hablar de Dios no es fácil, hacerlo de forma significativa es muy, muy complicado, y ella está haciendo desde hace mucho tiempo un gran esfuerzo en este sentido, que es de agradecer. Va a decir unas palabras para ya poner punto final a este acto el profesor Pablo de Felipe.
Pues primero, muchas gracias por la conferencia, por el esfuerzo de preparar esta síntesis de tanto trabajo. Y bueno, simplemente para despedirnos, pues quería decir que llegamos al final de esta 10ª conferencia. Desde el Centro de Ciencia y Fe quería dar las gracias tanto a la Fundación Federico Fliedner como a la Cátedra Francisco José Ayala de Ciencia, Tecnología y Religión por la colaboración que ha permitido realizar este evento, y también a otras 2 instituciones que han colaborado de diferente manera, tanto la Facultad de Teología SEUT como la Asociación de Teólogas Españolas, la ATE, y comentar, como se ha dicho también, que la doctora Coakley participará también en las 17ª jornadas de la ATE, que son este mismo fin de semana en Madrid. También agradecer a la Universidad de Comillas el permitirnos utilizar estas estupendas instalaciones, Y comentar que el vídeo de la conferencia estará en un futuro en la nueva web que hemos abierto con este 10º aniversario, que es conferenciasfliedner.org, y también en la web habitual del Centro de Ciencia y Fe, que es cienciayfe.es. Y también esperamos ofrecer en un futuro no muy lejano el texto íntegro traducido de la conferencia, que imagino que podrá ser de ayuda para poder leerlo con más calma y reflexionar sobre estos complejos temas. Creo que es importante destacar el logro que para nosotros representa haber podido llegar a la 10ª cita anual con estas conferencias. Cada año es una aventura. Y llegado a este punto, pues se impone algo de reflexión para diseñar lo que puede ser la próxima década. Si todo sigue adelante, como espero, pues nos volveremos a encontrar el próximo año por estas fechas, en algún momento en otoño. Todavía no tenemos esto formalizado, con la idea de seguir explorando estas relaciones de manera interdisciplinar entre ciencia, filosofía y religión. Recordar la encuesta que tenemos también y también el formulario de amigos del Centro de Ciencia y Fe. Si nos dejan su correo electrónico podremos enviarles información de otras actividades y del próximo año. Y también, si quieren apoyarnos, pueden hacerlo con ese formulario. Pueden dejarlo a la salida en la mesa y pues simplemente darles muchas gracias y esperamos volvernos a ver en otra ocasión. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Pablo. Wonderful question. Very, very good question.
Well, the person asking